So before going on to finish grammatology, I want to do a kind of a footnote here on Derrida's essay, Signature Event Context, which is an essay that he wrote in 1970 or 71, I believe, in which he delivered at a conference his theory about speech and writing and how he believes that speech is a kind of writing. And he comes up with an interesting theory. This was a conference on communication, and he was asked to give a paper on communication, which would then make the paper fall basically into the rubric of a kind of media studies. But what's interesting about this paper to me is that everything that he says in it can be directly contrasted with traditional McLuhan-esque media studies, because Derrida, though he mentions McLuhan, I think for purposes of propriety in this essay, never read him, and certainly if he read him, didn't internalize him, because there is no, almost everything that Derrida says about writing in media is completely opposed to what McLuhan said. So if you want to generate, as a media studies project, a kind of cognitive friction in your psyche, then read McLuhan and then follow it with a reading of Derrida, and the two rub up against each other. It would have been interesting to see the two go back and forth in a conversation. So what happens in this essay is that Derrida starts off by dwelling on the polysemic or polysemic meanings of the word communication itself, and he wonders, do we have a clear understanding of what the word communication means? Is everyone here clear on this? Because it has, in addition to a semiolinguistic meaning of the carrying of a content from a sender to a receiver that carries a thought or an idea, we also have the physical idea that communication, you can propagate a force through communication. A tremor or a force can be propagated, can communicate in that sense. And there's also the sense in which one city can be said to communicate with another by means of a passageway or a tunnel. So there are these other senses, these physical senses of the word communication, that might seem to be more original, but we would not want to say that the semiolinguistic understanding of communication is something that is derivative and secondary from these physicalistic forms of communication by mere way of the means of a metaphor. We wouldn't want to do that. So it's a question of hierarchy of meanings. In a dictionary, the logocentric approach is, of course, you have the primary meaning of the word that's listed first, and then all the secondary meanings of it. And what Derrida wants to do is to keep in our minds this idea that words are polysemic, they have multiple meanings. And so he then goes on to say that if we bring in the word context and we situate communication within context, then the context, especially the one that he's in now here where he's delivering this paper at this colloquium, the context then will restrict the meaning of the word for us, and we should be able to at least agree on what we think we mean by the word communication in a semiolinguistic sense at this conference. So he's trying to bring to your attention the idea that context changes the meaning of a signifier. Once a signifier is removed from one context and put into another, the context changes the meaning. And indeed, the signifier can generate whole new contexts. So this is how he starts the essay off, and then he moves on into a discussion of writing and telecommunication. And first of all, he says that the traditional understanding of writing in relationship to the oral tradition of speech is simply that writing basically is an extension of speech. It simply extends across time and space. It gives a greater reach to oral gesture and speech than the immediacy and pure presentness of oral tradition and communication would manage otherwise. Writing simply extends this across a larger homogeneous space. So it's simply seen in traditional Western metaphysical philosophy as an extension of speech. It doesn't alter, and this is where the tradition and also Derrida differs very much from McLuhan, that writing doesn't alter the contents. The same ideas that were uttered in the oral tradition can be uttered or can be communicated in a vehicular way by means of writing without changing the content at all. So this is a kind of media theoretical naivete in which there is no recognition that writing as a medium has a bias which is very different from the bias of oral communication. They have very different biases, which is one of the main axioms of American media studies here that Derrida flies in the face of. And so he goes to a text of Condillac, and he says that this philosopher Condillac basically develops a theory of writing in which he says that writing was simply this natural development of the extension of knowledge and ideas, first with the drawing of pictures in pictographic writing, and then it became gradually more abstract, but it basically is simply a seamless extension of the oral tradition. And he also mentions that the main idea, and this becomes the key idea for Derrida's theory of writing, is the idea of absence, that the addressee, the person that the writer is sending the writing to, is absent. So that you're always writing in the Western tradition, the metaphysical tradition, you're writing to an audience that isn't there. And that's the primary difference traditionally between writing and speech in the tradition. Derrida is going to contest that difference in a moment. And what he does then is he proceeds to point out that with this idea of absence, Condillac has hit on something here essential, but he hasn't discussed the idea of absence in terms of the sender. It's the sender's absence that's important as well, because the author himself is absent. When you're reading a text, the author is no longer there. So you as the receiver of the text, you're reading it, the author isn't there. The author might be dead or simply not present. So there is a certain non-presence. Now remember, in the logocentric tradition, logocentrism is a metaphysics of presence to which writing is seen as a kind of absence that's merely supplemental to it. Derrida takes this absence and runs with it to develop his own theory of media here, of communication, as based on the absence, a kind of ontology. I wouldn't use that word easily with Derrida, but a kind of ontology of absence which displaces the concept of writing and reframes it in terms of his theory of différance as endless chains of signification. So it's absence that's the key thing, absence of both addressee and absence of the sender. And the second point that he wants to draw your attention to that is missed by Condillac is the fact that the thing about writing that makes it writing as such, that's built into the very structure of the mark of writing, and this is a key term for him, mark, is its iterability, is its legibility. The writing has to be legible. In the absence of the sender, I have to be able to still read and understand. I may not fully understand what the sender intended in sending this message, but I have to be able to read it and iterate it in the sense of citing it, grafting it onto a text, and citing it, putting it into the context of another text. That's the iterability that he means by legibility. Writing has to be legible in that sense, that it can be divorced from its originary source, from the source of the author or the context that originated. It has to be capable of being divorced from that. And that removes it from the metaphysics of presence, of course, and divorcing it from its originary context and the author that sent it. And its iterability then is the key thing about it. It has to be something that is capable of citation, of repetition, of putting into other contexts. And that iterability then becomes absolutely essential to the structure of the mark of writing. So the mark, for him, is a word that he uses. A mark is a sign that has been divested of the metaphysics of presence. That is to say, it isn't just a mark on a page, although it includes that within it, because a mark can be either a grapheme or a phoneme. There are vocal marks that are signifiers that have no ontological existence because they're not in they don't have presence. If a trace is, just in the same way he says that a trace does not exist, because if you say that a trace is, then you give it a metaphysics of presence, which precisely it does not have. The same thing with a mark. A mark is also a kind of trace that has been divested of a metaphysics of presence. And he says then that the thing about both speech and writing is that they are both composed in terms of the structure of their mark of unities of iterability. So he wants to know then, or what he wants to do is to take this concept of absence and iterability and to extend it generally across all media. And he wants to say, is it possible then that we can say of all other media, all different forms of writing, in all the different languages, as well as speech, can we say that absence governs this in a general sense as well as iterability? And the answer will turn out to be, of course, yes, we can. Speech is basically, he says in this essay, composed of units of iterability as well that are capable of being cited. When somebody utters something, the same way as in writing, when somebody utters something, you have to be able to, it has to be quotable, basically. It has to be understandable, separable through things like inflection and tone and accent. Those things have to be, a signifying form has to be capable of being divorced from the accidents of the noise that degrade the message, as it were. And in that sense, what you have is a unit that is iterable in the same way that you have in writing. So he says that speech then basically is no different from writing insofar as it is also separable from its original context. So the important things for him is that the signifiers in both speech and writing are separable from their original context, and they are capable of being inscribed and grafted into other contexts. And this is his idea, of course, that the signifier is no longer grounded by the signified. It now exists. All the signifieds now exist outside the context of the metaphysically encoding systems that encoded them and gave them their sense and significance in a metaphysics of presence. That's all gone now, and what we have are chains of signifiers, chains of iterable, repeatable, legible signifiers, whether in speech or in writing. And to this extent, then, he's basically saying that speech and writing, from the point of view of his displacement of writing as différance, the deferral of meaning, the difference of signification, basically they're the same thing. And insofar as his theory of writing goes as différance. And I think that you could not find a stronger contrast to the McLuhan idea of media studies, in which every medium has its own bias. For example, there are things that you can do, according to McLuhan, in writing that you can't do in the oral tradition. In the oral tradition, everything is heavily mnemonically patterned and formulae. That changes the content of the information, because when you look at a text that was originally oral, like Homer's Iliad, there are lots of key mnemonic tricks and devices, such as the wise Nestor or the wily Odysseus, that are used as mnemonic checking points that enable the oral bard to remember vast bodies of text within his mind. So there are lots of differences in the oral tradition that are completely different from the written tradition. The written tradition has a bias that enables you to do, it opens up a new cognitive space that enables you to do new things that are completely different from what you could do in the oral tradition. And this basic tenet of American media studies is completely at odds with Derrida's basically a facing of the differences between speech and writing in an attempt to rescue writing from domination and tyranny by the metaphysics of presence in the logocentric tradition. So then he moves on to a theory of Austin's idea of the distinction between performative utterances and constative utterances. Constative utterances are simply the traditional semiological assertive statements, but a performative utterance is a type of statement that actually makes something happen, such as, for example, when you say "I do" in a marriage vow, or when you say "let's begin," and we begin. Or "everyone please be seated," and everyone sits down. So a performative utterance makes something happen, almost like in the magical tradition, in the magical consciousness structure. When you utter the name or the word, it actually brings about the effects magically. It's almost a kind of archaic residua of that magical, sympathetic magic, whereby the word has the power to evoke the thing. But Austin says then that the performative utterance, or Derrida rather says of it, that this is a kind of original idea of Austin's, that he's managed to step outside the traditional semiolinguistic limits of traditional linguistics, which is just about the communication of a thought or idea through a medium, into a new space where you actually have an action that is being made to happen through uttering something, making it take place. He says this is original and novel. But he says the problem with the performative utterance in Austin is that it excludes the possibility of citation, and it regards iterability, in other words, as something that is parasitic on ordinary situations of language. Austin says, for example, that a poet, the quotation of performative utterance in a poem renders it hollow, or a soliloquy of an actor on stage quoting a performative utterance renders it basically hollow and ineffective and void, and therefore something artificial about it, and something that should not be, something that's abnormal and is basically parasitic. But Derrida says, no, the problem with the performative utterance is that it is itself a kind of citation. When you say "I do" in a wedding vow, or when you say "let's begin" and "we begin," you are doing a kind of citation. It's a citation that's different from the type of citation in a play or in a text, but it is nonetheless a type of citation that is made possible by the very model, by conforming to the very model of iterability in the first place. So Austin's performative utterance doesn't, for him, hold any water. in that sense.